Chapter 8. In a little while all interest was taken up in stretching our necks and watching for the Pony Rider, the fleet messenger who sped across the continent from St. Joe to Sacramento, carrying letters 1,900 miles in 8 days. Think of that for perishable horse and human flesh and blood to do. The Pony Rider was usually a little bit of a man, brimful of spirit and endurance. No matter what time of the day or night his watch came on, and no matter what it was, winter or summer, raining, snowing, hailing or sleeting, or whether his beat was a level straight road or a crazy trail over mountain crags and precipices, or whether it led through peaceful regions or regions that swarmed with hostile Indians, he was always ready to leap into the saddle and be off like the wind. There was no idling time for a Pony Rider on duty. He rode 50 miles without stopping, by daylight, moonlight, starlight, or through the blackness of darkness, just as it happened. He rode a splendid horse that was born for a racer, and fed and lodged like a gentleman. Kept him at his utmost speed for 10 miles, and then as he came crashing up to the station, where stood 2 men holding fast a fresh, impatient steed, the transfer of rider and mailbag was made in a twinkling of an eye, and away flew the eager pair, and were out of sight before the spectator could get hardly the ghost of a look. Both the rider and horse went flying light. The rider's dress was thin and fitted close. He wore a roundabout and a skull cap, and tucked his pantaloons into his boot tops like a race rider. He carried no arms. He carried nothing that was not absolutely necessary, for even the postage on his literary freight was worth $5 a letter. He got but little frivolous correspondence to carry. His bag had business letters in it mostly. His horse was stripped to all unnecessary weight. He wore a little wafer of a racing saddle and no visible blanket. He wore light shoes or none at all, and little flat mail pockets strapped under the rider's thigh would hold about the bulk of a child's primer. They held many, many important business chapter and newspaper letter, but these were written on paper as airy and thin as gold leaf nearly, and thus bulk and weight were economized. The stagecoach traveled about 100 or to 120 miles a day, 24 hours. The Pony Rider about 250. There were about 80 pony riders in the saddle all the time, night and day, stretching in a long, scattering procession from Missouri to California, 40 flying eastward and 40 towards the west, and among them making 400 gallant horses earn a stirring livelihood and see a deal of scenery every single day of the year. He had had a consuming desire from the beginning to see a Pony Rider, but somehow or other all that passed us and all that met us managed to streak by in the night, and so we heard only a whiz and a hail and a swift phantom of desert gone before we could get our heads out of the window. But now we were expecting one along. Every moment would see him in broad daylight. Presently the driver exclaims, "Here he comes!" Every neck is stretched further, and every eye strained wider, and away across the endless dead level of the prairie a black speck appears against the sky, and it is plain that it moves. Well, I should think so. In a second or two it becomes a horse and rider, rising and falling, sweeping toward us, nearer and nearer, growing more and more distinct and more sharply defined, nearer and still nearer, and the flutter of the hoofs comes faintly to the ear. Another instant, a whoop and a hurrah from our upper deck, a wave of the rider's hand, and no reply. And man and horse burst past our excited faces and go winging away like a belated fragment of a storm. So sudden is it all, and so like a flash of unreal fancy, that per the flake of white foam left quivering and perishing on the mail sack after the vision had flashed by and disappeared, we might not have doubted whether we had seen any actual horse and man at all. Maybe. Well, we rattled through Scott's Bluffs Pass by and by, It was along here somewhere that we first came across genuine, unmistakable alkali water in the road, and we cordially hailed it as a first-class curiosity and a thing to be mentioned with éclat in letters to the ignorant at home. This water gave the road a soapy appearance, and in many places the ground looked as if it had been whitewashed. I think the strange alkali water excited us as much as any wonder we had come upon yet, and I know we felt very complacent and conceited, and better satisfied with life after we had added it to our list of things we had seen and some other people had not. In a small way, we were the same sort of simpletons as those who climb unnecessarily the perilous peaks of Mont Blanc, the Matterhorn, and derive no pleasure from it except the reflection that it isn't a common experience. But once in a while one of these parties trips and comes darting down the long mountain crags in a sitting posture, making the crusted snow smoke behind him, flitting from bench to bench and from terrace to terrace, jarring the earth where he strikes and still glancing and flitting on again, sticking an iceberg into himself every now and then and tearing his clothes, and snatching at things to save himself, taking hold of trees and fetching them along with him, roots and all, starting little rocks now and then, big boulders and acres of ice and snow and patches of forest, gathering and still gathering as he goes, adding and still adding to his vast and sweeping grandeur as he nears a 3,000-foot precipice, till at last he waves his hat magnificently and rides into eternity on the back of a raging and tossing avalanche. This is all very fine, but let us not be carried away by excitement, but ask calmly, how does this person feel about it in his cooler moments next day, with 6,000 or 7,000 feet of snow and stuff on top of him? We crossed the sand hills near the scene of the Indian mail robbery and massacre of 1856, wherein the driver and the conductor perished, and all the passengers but one. It was supposed, but this must have been a mistake, for at different times afterward on the Pacific coast, I was personally acquainted with 133 or 4 people who were wounded during that massacre and barely escaped with their lives. There was no doubt of the truth of it. I had it from their own lips. One of these parties told me that he kept coming across arrowheads in his system for nearly 7 years after the massacre, and another of them told me that he was stuck so literally full of arrows that after the Indians were gone he could raise up and examine himself. He could not restrain a tear, for the clothes were completely ruined. The most trustworthy tradition avers, however, that only one man, a person named Babbitt, survived the massacre, and he was desperately wounded. He dragged himself on his hands and knee, for one leg was broken, to a station several miles away. He did it during portions of 2 nights, lying concealed one day and part of another, and for more than 40 hours suffering unimaginable anguish from hunger, thirst, and bodily pain. The Indians robbed the coach of everything it contained, including quite an amount of treasure.